Welcome to Medicine 3.0, your podcast for learning all about healthcare, precision health, AI in health. Today, I am very excited to have my co-founder and the CEO of Bionic Health, Robbie Allen. He started his career as a distinguished engineer at Cisco and has been a business builder for the last couple decades. I'm excited for you to hear his story and to learn more about him. So let's jump right in. Hey, Robbie, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, Jared, glad to be here.
It's like I never see you, so
I know.
I'm excited to actually, face to face like this.
I know. I think it's our first time doing something like this. So.
It is our first time doing something like this. We've watched each other be grilled and interviewed, but I've never actually had the chance to like grill you, so this is going to be fun.
Yeah, nice.
So let's start off. I'd love to hear kind of have the audience hear your background, kind of how you ended up where you're at today. So you can take as long as you want, monologue, tell us your origin story. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So, I started off in computer science. I worked at Cisco for 13 years. I rose up to be a distinguished engineer, which was their top technical position, but, kind of started getting tired of big company life after all that time and decided I wanted to start a company of my own. And so in 2010, I started a company called Automated Insights, which in hindsight now is one of the first commercial generative AI companies. Before generative AI was even a term, we called it natural language generation, or NLG back in the, it's kind of the corollary to natural language processing, but instead of reading text, you were creating text. And so I developed a bunch of algorithms that would take data and then summarize it to sound like how a person might describe the data in text form. And so this was in the early days of big data. A lot of companies were trying to collect a bunch of data just because that was the cool thing to do then, but they didn't know what to do with the data. And so I had built this new company to help other companies understand their data better. And so that was a lot of fun. We, were really at the early days of a lot of practical AI. And our biggest challenge was just convincing people that this was actually a real technology, because we'd go in and say, all right, for a set of data, and some of our early applications were in sports. And so I would ingest a bunch of sports data and then, for example, a box score from a game, and it would produce a recap of the game. And we'd show people this, and they would ask, so who wrote this? And I said, well, the software wrote it, and they just wouldn't believe it. Again, this was 14 years ago, and so to see how far we've come over that time is it's been fascinating. So 2015, we were acquired by Vista Private Equity. After that, I started working on my PhD in machine learning at UNC for a brief time before I joined another machine learning company. Did that for a little while. Then the pandemic hit, and did a lot of fun stuff during the pandemic. Different side projects, homeschooled my kids. We traveled a fair amount. But then coming out of the pandemic, this was kind of the summer of 2022. I was ready to start another company, and so the question is what company would I start? What was the idea around? And the challenge was, at that point, I had been involved with enough companies, including my own. I had invested in a bunch of startups that it was pretty easy for me to pick holes in any sort of, especially B2B SaaS business plan I'd see, because that's what I had really been focused on over the last 10 years. But I believe that naive entrepreneurs are the most powerful people in the world. And my challenge was I needed to make myself naive again in some aspect of entrepreneurship. And I knew I wanted to do something related to machine learning and AI, because that's where I'd spent the last decade. And so I thought, well, one way to do that is to work in an industry I hadn't really operated in before. And so, I had a short list there, and, it just so happened along this last, 6, 7 years, I'd gone through a healthcare journey of my own that was pretty unsatisfying. And, kind of dating back. And I've had a primary care doctor that I've been seeing for over 20 years, and he's great. Um, but it's just kind of the typical story that you might hear pretty often. When I was in my early 30s, when I was running my first startup, I went in and it wasn't very healthy. I hadn't really worked out or exercised much in 10 years. I hadn't, been eating well. And for whatever reason, we tested my testosterone levels and they were like really low, off the charts low, especially for an early 30-year-old. And so, after a year of, supplementing testosterone and all of that, my levels got back up into the sort of low normal range. And I went in to get my annual physical, and I asked my doctor, so how did my testosterone look this year? And he said, what do you mean? I was like, well, when we test, I assumed that was included in my blood work. How did it look? He's like, well, I didn't ask for that to be tested because we fixed that last year. And I was like, well, we fixed it, but like, we didn't even know why it happened. Who knows if I have low testosterone now or not, so, and then it just started this ongoing battle every year where I would go in to get the blood work done and I'd ask if testosterone was included. They say no. And I say, all right, well, go get the doctor. I wanted this included. And again, it just was too hard. And I never really understood that. It was a fight to get, other kind of basic tests included. And so, I had that experience. I'd been getting more into my own health. I'd started wearing a Fitbit in like 2012, started working out more, started, reading more and learning more, following people like Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman. And, and so once I got to this point of wanting to start another company, especially in an area that I wasn't necessarily familiar with from a business perspective, healthcare was at the top of the list because I thought, I'm like probably a lot of people that don't understand why it's as bad as it is, and it seems like it should be better. And I knew, there's lots of people that would tell me that I was crazy for wanting to get into healthcare because it's so difficult and it's so hard to change. But like, I didn't know why that was, and so, in other words, I was pretty naive as to why I can't make a difference in healthcare, and so that was what led me down the path of really wanting to kind of go after doing something around automation in healthcare, to hopefully improve the system.
Now, healthcare is a giant industry. With your first business, did you guys ever look at going after healthcare?
We typically didn't because of like HIPAA issues, right? Like our whole thing was we needed lots of data. And
Yeah.
that still tends to be the case in virtually any machine learning application. You need a lot of data. And, if we would explore those areas, we'd quickly run into things like, well, you're not HIPAA compliant. We don't have a HIPAA compliant infrastructure. There's this fairly long list of requirements we'd have to meet if we were actually going to engage in that. So we never really went down that path.
hmm It's interesting. So you started collecting data. I mean, wearables, they've been around, 15, 20 years, say when Fitbit first started and there was the Jawbone and there was like all the early, many dead startups in the wearable space. And you started collecting that data. You've been using it for that long. How useful has that data been kind of on your health journey?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, so Jawbone was an early customer of ours at Automated Insights. So I remember, and this was again early days. They were, originally, headphones and that type of thing, but then they wanted to get into the wearable space, and that was the one area where we thought, well, lots of data. It's not necessarily covered under HIPAA, so we could potentially apply our algorithms to that space. And so we actually did go down that path. What we found was, again, especially in the 2011, 12, 13 timeframe, is it was still too nascent of a market. It was really mostly, biohackers and people like that were, doing much. Plus, the devices weren't that great back then. So it was pretty limiting. But, I started collecting that data. And I was always very underwhelmed, and I still am to this day. In fact, I wear an Oura Ring and an Apple Watch. I wore a Fitbit for over 10 years. I've used Whoop for a while, and I'm still pretty underwhelmed at the insights that most of these devices are able to help surface. And then I remember going into my primary care doctor, the same one I mentioned earlier, in one year and saying, "Hey, I've got 10 years of this Fitbit data. Can I make it available to you?" And he's like, "Nah, nah, it's okay. I don't need it." And so, it wasn't very helpful there. um, for me now, I've kind of organized all of my wearable data and my healthcare data. In fact, anybody can go check it out at bionic.robbieallen.com. So if you go to that URL, it takes you to a Google sheet where I've got all of my data. And so I'm one of those that I don't really care who sees my all my biomarkers and all my health data. In fact, I wanted to share it to hopefully help spur on the discussion around looking at this data, analyzing the data. What can you use from it? And so to answer your question, is it useful to me all these years later? Well, because I started as a Fitbit person, step counting was a big thing for me. I've since learned like Apple Watch and others, not as focused on steps, it's more activity, which is totally fine. But I kind of use steps as a anti-sedentary measure. Am I at least getting a certain number of steps a day? Not because I think 10,000 is the right number or 8,000 or whatever, but it's just because like if I got 10,000 steps in a day, I know I was moving around sufficiently. And I just kind of like that for me. And so, yeah, I've been tracking, step data. I have, pretty detailed step data back to 2016, started collecting sleep data then. And so it's mostly interesting to me to track trends over time. It's not as much like what happened this week. I kind of have a good sense of that, but it's like, sure enough, every summer, starting in June, going through August, my steps increase, to a certain level. It kind of helps me know year to year, as you get older, especially I'm 47 now. I'd like to kind of maintain my level of activity. And I think it's very easy for things to start to decline imperceptibly. Like you wouldn't even know it unless you were looking at that. Or maybe over time, your sleep is gradually getting worse. And, a couple years later, you're like, wait a second, I just don't sleep as much now as I did 2 years ago, I don't think. But you don't really have the data to back that up. And so to me, it's mostly interesting to kind of look at those long-term trends.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's interesting as you look at health over time. There's like this gradual slope decrease that you see, and so it's useful to see that. And then we're all most likely going to go through these episodes where we see sharp decreases, where we have injury or surgery or illness. And knowing where you were is so helpful to try to get back up at least as close as you were to your previous baseline. And if you don't know what that is, it's pretty impossible to shoot for a target you don't know. You've been tracking data. You decide, I want to work in healthcare. You and I have known each other for years. I still remember you reaching out and pinging me about meeting at Starbucks, and it was a beautiful spring morning. Ideas were flying, like, magical startup story. But, I think I'm curious, as you kind of talk to different people at that time, and you started kind of thinking about where you might want to put your energy, because both you and I take this stuff super serious. Like if you're going to build a business, you got to plan on a decade or 2 decades. Like this is a big effort to go after. And before kind of throwing yourself into an effort like that, what were some of the things that you were thinking about? What were some of the decisions you were making to say, okay, I want to work on this, and this is the right time to work on it?
So the first thing was like, what's the general industry? Because that kind of then rules in and out different types of people you may be able to work with or not. As soon as I was, kind of sold on doing something in healthcare, I then needed to find somebody that I knew and trusted in healthcare. And you were at the top of the list. Lucky you. It was, we had that great experience when, I was your independent board member at iScribes. You were just the perfect combination of, I needed, if I was going to get something in, get involved in something that really required a expert physician level understanding of what was going on. It needed to be a doctor. It needed to be somebody, and ideally somebody that, had practiced before and understood, all the challenges with, taking care of people and all of that. But then, and so you obviously check that box. But then the other piece was you're a technologist and you're an entrepreneur. And so like all of those, it was, a little bit different for me because like with my first startup, I was a solo entrepreneur. And sure, I'd built a great team, and they filled in a lot of the gaps that I had. But at the end of the day, when you're the solo entrepreneur, there's people look to you for everything, whether it's any questions on culture or any questions on the business or the technology or all that stuff. I had to kind of be ultimately the person that answered those questions. And so this time around, when I was thinking about another company, I thought, well, I totally would be open to not being the one and only person, because there's a lot. It's a heavy lift, if you can find the right person. And the great thing about you is you'd been the CEO of a company before, and so if we could figure out like the leadership structure, then to me that would be sort of an ideal situation. Because oftentimes when you have two founders come together, maybe one had been a CEO before, the other hadn't, or one's the CEO and the other one's another role, but they kind of view themselves as they could also be the CEO or whatever, but they'd never done it before. We had both gone down that road, and frankly, one of the early questions is like, all right, you be the CEO. I was like, no, you be the CEO. I was like, I'd rather you be the CEO. I was like, I'll just be the CTO. And so,
Yeah.
I think that kind of set the stage well for us getting started.
Yeah, I think that was a good signal. I think that's a good understanding. Like both people really understand how hard the job of CEO is, when both people are like, no, I'd rather not. How about you?
And that's, and again, it's been great with you on this, because you understand. I mean, like, you're very understanding of like the position I'm in, and I try to be understanding of your role. I think there's a kind of mutual respect there that's sometimes harder to have if you hadn't kind of lived in those shoes before.
Yeah, yeah, no, much easier the second time around with all the understanding, and we've built an awesome team. So when you decide, okay, this is the space, this is the general industry, this is the person I'm gonna like co-found this with. And you and I, we whiteboarded all sorts of different ideas. We talked about little point solutions and widgets. And we when we sat down and we looked at that whiteboard, this is when I'm like, we're both crazy, because we both were like, no, let's do the hardest thing on that
Yeah.
board. But I'd love to hear kind of your kind of recollection of like why you felt drawn to the problem we're trying to solve, and why you thought we could be successful at it.
Yeah. Again, I had an idea that, so I knew I would enjoy working with you again. And this was something that I was, innately interested in, like I said, around personal health and and that. And obviously, like, I'm really a believer in the future of AI and machine learning and the impact that's going to have on society. And so I wasn't that interested in doing kind of a niche thing. Again, we could have picked something that would be, require less capital, would have been much quicker time to market, would have been, quote, a lot easier. Um, but that just wasn't as interesting to me. I wasn't looking for like a 1 or 2 year or a 3 year gig. I was looking for, like you said, a 10+ year gig. And so that kind of set itself up for being okay with something that would be harder. Um, and then again, I'm a technologist at my core, and so I get excited about doing things that's not been possible in the past, and especially with the advent of LLMs and the progress that's been made in machine learning in the last few years. I got excited that the notion that you really could start to automate a lot of what doctors and clinicians do was a reality in a way that it's never been in the past. And so for me, that's in my wheelhouse for tackling stuff like that. I mean, early on in my first company, it kind of got lumped into automating journalism, even though that was a little bit misguided. But we'd have lots of stories, including in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, of the robot holding a pen and writing it, like that kind of accompanied almost every story about automated insights. And um, and but it was kind of a neat, kind of goal to go after. I don't know, can we automate journalism? Can we automate, to what extent can we do that? And now kind of the corollary is, can we automate what it takes to be a doctor? And of course, this isn't like 100%. We're not going to
Yeah.
automate a doctor in totality, not anytime in the near future, at least. But the thought that we could automate clinical decision support, when all the attempts in the past have been based off of things like decision trees and other things that are pretty brittle in nature, and they've not really worked well. Now, I could see a path that it could be automated in a way that previously unscalable businesses now could be much more scalable, because you could take, for at least clinical based models, generally the number one expense in those models are the physician time. If we can make those physicians significantly more efficient than what they've been in the past, now those previously unprofitable business models, or typically very localized, like just a couple of clinics or a handful of clinics in one area, now you could consider doing something on a much larger scale, much more profitably. And so all of that just was really exciting to me.
Yeah. And what's interesting about your career is looking at kind of the arc of staying on the forefront of AI and automation, kind of through your early stat sheet and automated insights and rules-based AI, and then being early on machine learning and deep learning, and now kind of again early on applications of LLMs into current workflow. I think the big difference that I see between kind of people who theorize and people who actually put into production technologies, there's a big gap there. And you're somebody I see as somebody who's willing to put things into production and then learn and iterate. When you think about some of the biggest challenges ahead for us, because you kind of talked about, it's automation of clinical decision support, it's scalability of something that isn't inherently scalable. What are some of the challenges that you get most excited about, where you think, I really can't wait until we kind of prove out this piece or that piece as far as making this technology more available to more people?
Well, one of the big differences with this company relative to my previous companies is, the impact I believe we could have on humanity, right? And that sounds, maybe a little over the top, but I remember early on when I went to my wife, I was like, all right, I want to do another startup. And she's like, do you really have to do another startup? Can't you just go back to work at Cisco or something? And I was like, no, I don't think I can do that. But like with this company, you know, what I can promise you, and who knows, how these things evolve over time. But the great thing about the promise of Bionic Health is, at the end of the day, you were going to help a lot of people get healthier,
Mhm.
right? And even with my other companies, we had successful exits and we built great technology. I can't look back and say like we really put a dent in the universe, or that we really helped a lot of people in significant ways. Um, but with Bionic, we can already say a year in, we've already helped a bunch of people get healthier,
Yeah.
and that feels good, right? To me, that's the thing that's most exciting about, again, I'm a technologist, and so like I said, I get excited by the promise of automating. Like my whole career's been built on automating, dating back to like the first year I was at Cisco. I was there to write scripts to automate networking things, right? And so like my whole career's been built automating stuff. And even with the promise of trying to automate clinical decision support, the thing that gets me most excited is just the results that we're seeing from our members.
Yeah.
And these, already just a year in, we're seeing, I get feedback in many cases from people that we knew that signed up, that come to us and say, wow, this is great, or I've been able to see these changes. And these are pretty discerning, very, in some cases, technical people or very business savvy people that come to me and say that, we're making an impact on their life. And I've known some of these people for 10 plus years, 15 years, and I've never heard them talk about a solution like they're talking about Bionic. And so again, that's the piece that really just, it's not hard to wake up every day knowing that you can kind of have that impact. And now as we start to really grow aggressively and expand, the promise of an even bigger impact is just right there.
Yeah. No, I love, our big, hairy, audacious goal of, a million years added of health to people's lives. I think, we've all had loved ones who have gone through the last years of their lives in terrible health. And so the goal to like make those years as healthy as possible and make the healthy years I mean, even if it's not the last years of my life, if I can have 65 to 75 better than my dad had, or than those who went before us, I think it's such an exciting problem to try to tackle.
Yeah.
So as you think about kind of next steps for Bionic, you know, what are what are the big aggressive goals, or maybe the small iterative goals that you see us trying to go after that are going to make a difference for people around the country?
So I feel like we've done a good job over the last year proving out that if you go through the Bionic program, we can make an impact on, not only your future health span, but even how you feel today. Right. And that was necessary. Like when we were getting started, even though you had a great background, you didn't necessarily have the history of being a preventative medicine clinician, that was practicing actively. And so we needed a year to do that and to build that up. And now that we have all these great success stories, I feel like, the program that we've developed and will continue to develop is on the right path. And so the big opportunities for us now is to continue to build out our technology because, I always tell people it's really hard to automate something unless you really understand everything that goes into it. And that's why it's really hard to automate something from scratch unless you really understand the problem well.
Yep.
And so for us, it would be hard to completely automate the problem. That's why I'm a little skeptical, frankly, of startups in the healthcare space specifically, that out of the gate it's like completely automated solution. Well, I mean, you must really know the problem well because otherwise it's very hard to automate that. And it's
Yep.
the same with us. Now that we're a year in, we're in a much better position to build on that framework that we've developed to automate clinical decision support. So that's going to obviously continue to be a key for us, as well as developing tools and technology to help continue to help our members, right? So that's the piece that, like I said, I felt has been missing for a long time. And there's more and more solutions that are coming out in this space to help people visualize their wearable data. But like for us, we'll be one of the few places, frankly, in the country where you can have wearable data, you can have all your, biomarker data, you can have things that aren't necessarily blood-based results like DEXA scans and CGM data, your VO2 max, like all of that stuff in one place, under the guidance of a physician. And what we're hopefully helping people do is improve those numbers over time. And so the challenge for us is, presenting that information in a way that's digestible and understandable. And we have lots of conversations internally about how to do that and what's the right way to do that. But then also showing you how you're improving over time so that we can keep people motivated and continue to want to engage in health, because we know that it's really hard to stay engaged with health 24/7, right? We're all, experienced with having taken a week off or taken a month off or even longer, right? But then how do we get you back in? It's totally cool that if you need to take a month off, maybe you go traveling or maybe you just gotten busy, but then feeling good to come back in and re-engage, right? And this model throughout your life of, it doesn't have to be 100% constantly on my healthcare. I don't think that's practical, but having an environment such that you can come in and out as necessary over time, and that we can help you make those changes over time is going to be super important. And so, that'll be something that, again, we'll continue to work on that. We'll always be working on that. It'll never be solved, but that'll be another key piece, again, especially as we start to open up nationwide and we're seeing, many more people.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things about this problem that we're trying to solve is that it's one of these hard problems that will take us years to solve, but we get to start giving value to people we already have immediately. I'm going to hit you with a couple rapid fire questions that you
Uh-oh.
had no idea that are coming. So, but they're not hard ones unless they are, and then they're hard. So if you had to think about one book that you were going to give somebody, what's the one book you would give somebody?
I guess with that being the only context, I'd probably say Outlive, just because people that have read Outlive, that they kind of understand the scope of what Bionic offers.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. And everybody wants to know what your morning routine is.
Everyone wants to know what your morning routine is, and you still won't divulge it. So I don't
Nobody
know if
wants
I
to
could
know.
do
Nobody wants to know.
that. Everyone wants to know. At least everyone at Bionic Health wants to know. But all right, my morning routine, it's wake up around somewhere between 5 and 6 o'clock. Um, hopefully get up, and I try to get 10 to 15,000 steps in a day. Again, this is my sort of anti-sedentary measure. And I find that's much easier to do if I can get up and walk a mile like first thing in the morning. And so I try to do that. Then there's, depending on the time of the year, getting kids ready for school. I'll typically have like some sort of small meal slash snack. It could be anything from, eating some leftover protein from the night before, maybe some cottage cheese, something like that. Having my first sort of protein shake, then, um, and then it's off to school or camp or whatever my kids have going on. That kind of rounds it out.
Do you have a pump up song? You have any like soundtrack to the morning?
No, no, no pump up song. It's typically, podcasts and YouTube videos
Okay, so your pump up is Huberman and Atia
and Pelo. That's the
and
other
Pelo.
Pelo.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. That makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense. Well, Robbie, I think this was super helpful. I think this will be helpful for people getting to know Bionic Health, also just getting thinking through their own health journey, how to kind of think about technology and healthcare. So thank you so much for your time. You already told people where to find your data. Anything else that they should know if they want to go read more about you, find you on the internet?
That's probably bionic.robbieallen.com, to get out the data. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or, sometimes I'm on X/Twitter. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks so much, Robbie. Take
Yep.
care.
Thanks.